All right, hello everyone. So that's me. As I tell my students, if you are given the opportunity to talk, project your face on the biggest screen possible so then everyone can come find you in the bar. That's my blog, podcast, my essay collection, which I'll talk about in a second, and my Twitter and everything else, Blue Sky, podcast, whatever. So it's really nice to be here. Thank you very much. The Autonomous World Symposium that I went to last year in London, which Justin organised, absolutely blew me away. It was unbelievable. I hope the next few days sort of generate some really interesting collective conversations between us all about this new medium that we're working in, because I believe that autonomous worlds and the infrastructure that we build today might be the substrate for how people interact online in the future, full stop. But the main thing that I'd like us all to think about is how do we not fuck this up? I told Peter that this was the kind of subject of my talk, and he was like, maybe you should go first. So, so the discipline that I'm interested in is world running. We in this room are all collectively worlding worlds, but what happens next? How should they run? Who should run them? Governance, money, IP, narrative, agency, all of these things cohere in the discipline of world running. Worldrunning.guide is my essay collection. There's about 15,000 words or 16, 17 essays. So I know that everybody in this room knows what a world is when they see one. But our definitions may change depending on from person to person. But either it's a game, a book, a film, whatever, we know what we mean when we talk about worlds. That's because everybody in this room is the first world's native generation. Because worlds are new. They've been around since the 1970s, which I'm going to talk about, basically. So I'm also writing a book, which is called The Web Was a Side Quest. And the title is pretty self-explanatory. It's the anti-Matt Ball metaverse book. And I think that the web has been a 30-year-long distraction from what computers are actually for, which is for making worlds, not publishing web pages. And the thesis of the book, and that underpins all of my consultancy work, is all technosocial systems should be seen through the lens of worlds. So, where do worlds come from? And what are their history? And what follows is going to be an extremely compressed version of the answer to that question from the first part of my book, which is Worlds, a walkthrough. I'm going to skip through the prehistory of worlds because there's no need to talk about the mythic and the systemic narrative production and the storage medium that we know as astrology. Instead, I'm going to take you through the three main innovations that came together in the 1970s to create the most important social technology of the 20th century, which was D&D. But first, 7,000 years ago, these are the oldest archaeological evidence that we have for the humble six-sided dice, and they emerge fully formed into culture with opposite sides adding up to 7. We know that the Old Kingdom Egyptians used both 6- and 4-sided dice to play the game Senet, and the Romans and the Bronze Age and Bronze Age India were all obsessed with games and games of chance. But we didn't understand randomness until relatively recently. Christian Huygens published the first book on probability in 1657, which is fairly recent given that we've been playing with dice for 8,000 years. But it wasn't until the mid-1700s and the early 1800s that the discipline of statistics was widely understood, and names that we recognize from this period like Gauss and Belsay and Boole sort of begin to emerge. All of these men, Gauss and Boole, etc., lived in Prussia between 1750 and 1830. The area of Europe that is ground zero for the condition that we know today as modernity. And one of the key ideas that emerged at this time is the concept of legibility. And there's this hugely influential idea, and I recommend everyone check it out, comes from the anarchist anthropologist James C. Scott and his hugely influential book, Seeing Like a State. Legibility is both extremely complicated and a very simple idea. Scott, when researching the early nation state, began to see legibility as the central problem of statecraft. They lacked anything like a detailed map of the terrain or its people. Dual wielding is mental. I'm going to quote Venkat from Ribbon Farm, as he wrote a really good review of Seeing Like a State back in 2010. So the book is about a 2 to 3 century long process by which modern states reorganize the societies they governed to make them more legible to the apparatus of governance. The state is not interested in the rich functional structure and complex behavior of organic entities that they govern, i.e. humans, but also make up them. It merely views them as resources that must be organized. The idea is that states and governance mechanisms see, and what they see is information and statistics. So in order to be able to see things, it needs to be made legible. So what does this mean in practice? It means Prussian scientific forestry, which I bet you didn't come all the way to Lisbon to think you're going to learn about. So in the second half of the 18th century, Prussian rulers wanted to know how many natural resources they had in the tangled woods of the country. So they started counting. And they came up with these huge tables that would let them calculate how many board feet of wood they could pull from a given plot of land. Using this newfangled maths called statistics and probability, the Prussians simulated a forest. But, as you all know, if you've ever actually been to a forest, then trees don't grow in regular rows, nor do they go straight. And there's all different kinds of trees which have different uses. So there was nothing for it. And this is how modernity begins. Rather than make the simulation more accurate to include more detail and fill out more nuance of what the actual forest was, the solution was to cut the forest down and plant all the trees in rows. So the real world was reshaped to match the simulation. Facebook and platform capitalism still operate under the same logic. Like the forest, you aren't real to Facebook. You're a simulated data shadow produced by the database classifiers designed to sell you ads basically. And like the trees, Facebook would rather put us all in rows by training us to use their apps with dark UX patterns in order to make our own behavior more legible to them. So this is why legibility goes right the way through, from the beginning of modernity all the way up to platform capitalism, basically, and the concept of legibility that modernity has. The Prussian state simulated the forest and found it too complicated, so it made the forest behave in a way that matched the simulation. See also climate change. Anyways, pertinent to our story, at the very moment the Prussians were rearranging the forest, another idea was born. Das Kriegspiel, or the war game. How awesome is that? Just come up with the idea of the war game. Bold. So it was invented by this guy, Hellwig, handsome chap. But the idea was further developed by George Reiswitz and his son Jörg Reiswitz, who should be regarded as the grandfather of all simulations with his edition of Kriegspiel in 1815. Here's a little line from the rulebook's introduction. The idea of representing warfare graphically has been the object of much thought in both ancient and modern times, but it was not until the use of firearms that anyone tried to represent the movements and attacks of a modern army. Existing equipment had to be abandoned altogether, basically chess. So it's at the beginning of modernity that we find two ideas mirroring each other. Simulate the world and rearrange it, or simulate a tiny world that rearrange themselves using statistics and chance. And it's the second that we, I think, find ourselves sort of all ideologically aligned with. I don't have time for the 1800s and the development of tabletop war games, but it's worth mentioning that H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, the grandfathers of sci-fi, all played them. So the next key idea that we need to talk about is in the 1930s, and that is the idea of narrative play or role play. This guy, founder of the discipline of psychodrama, friend of Jung and nemesis of Sigmund Freud. Psychodrama is an action-based type of psychotherapy. Oh man, I'm not even halfway through. That involves acting out scenes from a person's life in order to gain insight about it. Monero is also, he invented the concept of Rollenspiel, or role play, and he was a truly remarkable man because he also invented social network analysis, because we all have roles that we play, and then you can link those roles that we interact with each other in order to invent social network analysis. So in the 20th century, role play has two separate lives. The first history is that it goes into the corporate world, and by the 1950s, the boardrooms were using role play to to excuse the mixed metaphor, to war game industrial relations with unions, for example. And it's my suspicion that the people around Gary Gygax in the 1970s were familiar with role play actually from work rather than the theatre, which is kind of interesting. And the second branch is improv, which is in the theatre world. And you've got Keith Johnston and Viola Spolin, who develops improv as we know it today. I had to cut a whole bunch of stuff out of this talk because improv is really important to the development of how people interact with games and how they think about them in the 20th century. But the short version is the people who played D&D in the 1970s were familiar with improv rather than role play in the business world. And that is extremely significant because they are the ones that took the interaction inside of a simulation and essentially created role play games as we know it today. Lastly, got the granddad, Tolkien. Don't need to really say much about him, other than Tolkien uses the term subcreation when he talks about the invention of Middle-earth. And I think subcreation is probably a really good or interesting word that we can use given the modular and permissionless nature of autonomous worlds. So you have your autonomous world, and then they get subcreated as they spawn out. So then all of these three ideas come together: legibility, wargames, improv, and world building come together in 1974 to create D&D, the social simulation technology that went on to change the world. Despite there only being 1,000 copies of the very first version of D&D in 1974, it went on to fuse with games and computers immediately. You get Colossal Cave in 1976, you get Mud in 1978, which is multiplayer interactive fiction, and then by 1979, all computers coming out of Data General were not considered bug tested unless they could run Colossal Cave. And then we should just take a moment to talk about this moment in the 1970s, about the colossal cultural vertigo that people must have had to be floating above a game, and the idea that you could zoom down and go inside the simulation and be inside it within its rules and physics is a colossal change to how humans have ever thought about simulations and storytelling. Then, following, just a few years later after the invention of D&D, we get a small little movie called Star Wars, which basically burst the multi-format consumer franchising. Fun fact, this is a photo of my teenage bedroom that I took on my first ever camera phone. But children did what apart from me, because I didn't play with them, but children did what they always did with toys, and that was they played with them. But the kids weren't simulating Star Wars with rules like a war game. They were instead playing by the narrative rules of the world. So what would the narrative archetype of the wise wizard Obi-Wan Kenobi do, finding out that Action Man had tied up Princess Leia at gunpoint? And the answer is, what would Obi-Wan Kenobi do? So coming to the end, so this is like the 1980s, it's my childhood, semiconductors swallow everything, cyberpunk arrives, blah, blah, blah. Choose your own adventure game books prepared as hypertext in the internet, and so on and so forth. You can read all about that in worldrunning.guide. And then by 1993, 10% of all traffic on the internet, right before the creation of the World Wide Web, 10% of all traffic was to online worlds, which is pretty huge when you think about it. So the web was a side quest. The web arrived, and everyone was onboarded into the pedestrian idea of multiplayer publishing when they could have been in Muds and Moos and, So it was up to the games industry. Then that had to steward the nearly 30 years of institutional knowledge about online worlds, virtual worlds, Muds, Moos, and that all went into the games industry in the form of graphical RPGs and MMOs. And remember that all techno-social systems should be streamed through the lens of worlds. So much of what I think the metaverse discourse that's going on at the moment is actually the other half of the computing industry, basically the games industry, looking at what the web platforms have done in the last 20 years, saying, look at the mess you've made, we're pretty sure we can do a better job. Ultimately, I think that's what the metaverse discourse is all about. Which brings me to my opening point. New worlds means new mistakes. Worlds are new, comparatively, since the 1970s. Blockchains are new, and autonomous worlds are still being born. They are the future of the world, and they might also be the future of the multiplayer web, full stop. So let's not fuck it up. Anyway, thanks.